In the silent halls of time, destinies are carved in shadows. One light against the endless dark. When the way is hidden, faith becomes the oar. Even in the silence, a light remains. Time forgets, but God remembers. Strength without surrender is still defeat. Some destinies are written in sacred ink. Welcome to Prayer Station. You've heard the story of a man so strong he could tear a lion apart, yet powerless when faced with love. He could carry the gates of a city but couldn't carry the weight of his own soul. That man was Samson. And this isn't just a story about strength. It's a warning to those who carry a calling, but live far from the one who called them. In a time of deep darkness, when the land of Israel groaned under the cruel oppression of the Philistines, hope seemed to vanish, prayers seemed forgotten by the heavens, and the promises of old, now only faded memories in the minds of the elderly. No miracles, no deliverance, no hero arose. The Philistines ruled like shadows, silent yet unstoppable. Each Hebrew village was under control, each father and mother watching their children grow up in fear. But when man is silent, God begins to act. And as always, he didn't begin with power, not with a general, not with a prophet, but with a woman. Her name was not recorded in Scripture. She was simply called the wife of Manoah, a barren woman, living in the silence of society and the ache of her heart. She could not bear children, and in those days that was considered a shame. No children meant no future, no worth, no promise, but she, the one forgotten by the world, was remembered by heaven. One day, while she was alone, maybe gathering firewood, fetching water, or simply crying silently again, a figure appeared, not an ordinary man, an angel, radiating light, not of fire but of peaceful authority. And the angel said, "You are barren, but you shall conceive and bear a son, and that child will begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." Imagine that moment. A woman with no name, no child, being told she would give birth to a deliverer. Not just any child, but a child set apart, a Nazarite, consecrated for life to the Lord from the womb. And the instructions were clear. Do not drink wine. Do not touch what is unclean, for the child within you will be holy from before birth. No thunder, no heavens shaking, just a sacred conversation between heaven and a forgotten woman. But that moment changed history, and she conceived. The child was born and was named Samson. The name means little sun, a small flame, born into the deepest night of Israel. And then the child grew, not in a palace, not under golden lights of glory, but in a humble village, where from the moment he could speak, he was told over and over again, "You are not like other children. You are set apart. You do not belong to this world." And he believed it. But like all of us, sometimes knowing who you are is the hardest thing in the world. That is when the real story begins, with a vow, with hair never cut, and with a strength from a source no one expected. Samson was unlike any other child in the village. From a young age, he was surrounded by strange instructions, sacred rules, and a divine atmosphere heavy with pressure. You must not drink wine. You must not touch a corpse, and above all, you must never cut your hair. He heard these words repeated, like a quiet hymn sung at every family meal, like a lesson rooted deep in his heart from his earliest steps. To Samson, hair was not just hair. It was the banner of his calling, the cord binding a man of raw instincts to a God of immense power. Each time his hair grew longer, he was reminded again, your strength does not come from you. It comes from the one who chose you. From adolescence, Samson began to feel it. When he held a stone, it seemed lighter. When someone pushed him, he didn't stagger. Rather, they fell. Something was not normal. Something was working inside him, a force not of this world. Samson didn't train like a warrior. He carried no sword. He wore no armor because his weapon was his consecration, and his armor was the Nazarite vow. Nazarite was not a title for the strong. It was for those called to be set apart. They were the ones who didn't follow the crowd, who didn't live by impulse, who didn't compromise with the flesh. In Numbers chapter 6, God gave 3 commands for a Nazarite. No wine or fermented drink. To keep a sober mind, free from lust and delusion. No contact with the dead, not even family. To remain separate from impurity, untouched by death. No cutting of hair. So all who saw them would know, this one is not of the world. But for Samson, the difference was his vow wasn't for a few weeks or months. It was for life. Even before birth, he belonged to God. He had no choice, no say in his own fate, and perhaps that was what planted a hidden crack in his soul. Part of him wanted to be faithful to God. The other part wanted to live like everyone else. To be chosen is an honor, but also a burden. Samson carried that burden all his life. And then, as we will see, when the Nazarite cord began to blur, when the hair, thought to be his strength, was taken lightly, that was when the Achilles heel of a hero was revealed. The vow was still there. His hair was still long. Power still surged through his fingertips. But the heart, the most important part, was starting to crack. Samson began stepping outside his boundaries. Not geographic borders, but spiritual ones. He went to Timnah, the land of the Philistines, and there he saw a woman, not an Israelite, not of the same faith, not of the covenant. But he said, "She pleases me. Get her for me as my wife." His parents were stunned, not because of her beauty, but because he, the one set apart, was stepping into a land not meant for him. And here's the frightening truth. Saints don't fall because of enemies, but because of things that seem harmless. The wedding happened. Tension simmered beneath the fine garments. The Philistines didn't like Samson, a Hebrew, and Samson didn't fully understand them, yet still married the girl because of emotion. Emotion, the thing that makes us human, but also what can burn down a vow. At the feast, Samson gave a riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. No one could solve it. Only Samson knew he had killed a lion. And later bees had nested in its carcass. He had eaten honey from it. A small act, but deeply symbolic. A man set apart had eaten honey from a corpse, something forbidden. And that was the first crack in the Nazarite vow. When the Philistines couldn't solve the riddle, they pressured his wife to seduce him. She begged, wept, wore him down, and finally, Samson gave her the answer. She immediately betrayed him, told her people. When exposed, Samson said a line that chills the soul. "If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have solved my riddle." Angry, humiliated, betrayed, Samson walked away from the wedding alone, but he still owed 30 outfits, the reward for the riddle. Samson didn't repay with an apology. He went to Ashkelon, killed 30 Philistines to steal their garments. A holy rage, but soaked in blood. Meanwhile, his father-in-law, thinking Samson had left, gave his wife to another man. And when Samson returned, he found his bride now belonged to someone else. That moment sparked a wildfire of fury. He caught 300 foxes, tied flaming torches to their tails, and released them into Philistine vineyards and grain fields. The fields burned, flames devoured the harvest, and shame had turned into fear. The Philistines retaliated. They burned his wife and her father alive. Samson not only lost the one he loved, he lost the last piece of humanity within him, and so he became wrath in human form. Samson struck with brutality, no longer a Nazarite, but a living weapon full of pain and loss. The Bible writes, "He struck them with a great slaughter, then went and dwelt in the cave at Etam." The cave, once a refuge for fugitives, now a shelter for a broken saint. And that is the saddest truth about Samson. He slew the enemies of God, but he could never slay the darkness growing within himself. And just like that, Samson's fury struck fear into his enemies, scorched their fields, and brought his foes to their knees. But when the smoke of battle cleared, when bodies lay scattered across the dry plains, a greater enemy was waiting for him. Not with swords, not with armor, but clothed in the form of a woman. Samson had faced lions, 1,000 Philistines, and city gates that weighed tons. But this time the opponent before him was a pair of tearful eyes, a voice dripping with sweetness, a smile that hit a blade. Her name was Delilah. The Bible writes, Samson loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. But that love was not met with love. It was met with a deal. The Philistine rulers came to Delilah. They brought no soldiers, no arrows. They brought silver. 1,100 pieces of silver from each leader. All to buy one thing, the secret of Samson's strength. Delilah agreed, and the plan began. At first, she asked gently, "My love, if someone wanted to bind you, how could they make you as weak as any man?" Samson smiled. He knew. He played. He said, "If they tie me with 7 fresh bowstrings not yet dried, I will be as weak as any man." Delilah did as he said. She called the Philistines to hide. But when she shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you!" he snapped the cords like burnt thread. She begged again. He lied again, new ropes, then weaving his hair into a loom. Each time, a dangerous game. But that game slowly softened the iron heart of a man once set apart. And then, she no longer cried. She struck his heart with words. "You don't love me. You've been deceiving me. 3 times now. You've never told me the truth." Day after day, the pleading, like water dripping on Samson's soul. Until one day, stone wore down, hair was lost, and faith began to tremble. Samson fell, not under whips, but under a whisper. He revealed the secret. "I am a Nazarite. My hair has never been cut, for I've been set apart to God from my mother's womb. If my hair is shaved, my strength will leave me." Delilah knew. This time it was real. She alerted the Philistines. That night, as Samson lay asleep on the lap of the woman he loved, a barber was summoned. Locks of hair fell to the floor, along with the pieces of his sacred vow. She shouted once more, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you!" He jumped up, as he always had, but this time, there was something he didn't know. He did not know that the Lord had left him. They captured him, not just bound him. They gouged out his eyes, and the one who once saw the purpose of his birth now dwelled in darkness, both body and soul. And so, the strongest man in Israel was now blind, chained, and led like an animal amid the laughter of his enemies. And so, the one who killed lions, carried gates, and struck down thousands was now being led in the dark, a pitiful failure. But the most painful thing wasn't losing his strength. It was knowing that God had left him. They bound Samson with bronze shackles, chained his hands and feet. No more songs of praise, no more eyes of admiration. Only the mocking laughter of enemies, echoing in a cold stone prison. Samson was taken to Gaza, the very place where he once carried away the city gates. Now the place he was caged, grinding grain like a domesticated beast, the one once set apart, now used for entertainment, the one empowered by God's Spirit, now fallen from forgetting his vow. And in that darkness, unseen, unnoticed, something began to happen. Each strand of hair, each trace of the Nazarite vow began to grow back. No one cared. To the Philistines, hair was just hair. They didn't understand. Hair was the sign of a sacred covenant. And as the hair returned, hope silently rose again. One day the Philistines held a great festival to their god Dagon, the one they believed had delivered Samson into their hands. The temple was packed. Leaders, soldiers, civilians, and those who once trembled at the name Samson. They gathered not to fight, but to mock. They called Samson out, not to kill, but for sport. A blind man led out into the temple like a chained mime for entertainment. But inside, something else was stirring. Samson turned his face toward heaven, where now he could no longer see, but his faith still had a flicker. And in that moment he did what he had rarely done with sincerity in his life. He prayed, "Sovereign Lord, please remember me, just this once. Please give me strength so I may avenge your enemies for the eyes they took from me." No more pride, no more games, no more ego, only a shattered soul, longing to be touched by God one last time. Samson asked to place his hands on the 2 central pillars of the temple. He felt them, not with sight, but with a heart broken and reforged by repentance. And then he drew a deep breath, braced himself, hands pressing against the massive stone columns. He did not cry out in pain, but in conviction. "Let me die with the Philistines!" Cracks thundered like a storm. The pillars trembled, the roof wavered, the ground roared, and in a single moment, everything collapsed. More than 3,000, including all the Philistine rulers, perished in the rubble, Samson as well, but the Bible says that in his death he killed more than he had during his life. And so, the man who failed in shame fulfilled his calling, not through victory but through surrender. I used to think Samson was a hot-headed, violent man who couldn't control himself, a rebellious hero given strength by God, only to use it for his own will. But the more I reflect, the more I see myself in him. I too once carried a promise. I too was born to do something greater. But there were times I drifted from God, not because I hated him, but because I was too easily drawn in by what sparkled before my eyes. Delilah wasn't just a woman. Delilah is a symbol of the things that pull us away from our calling. A toxic relationship, a small compromise we think no one will notice, an old wound we refuse to let go. Samson didn't lose his strength the moment he stepped out of his vow. He was still strong, still killed 1,000 men, still carried the city gates, but bit by bit, he stepped out of the holy zone. And then came a moment. He no longer knew the Lord had left him. That is the most terrifying part, not the loss of strength, but the loss of God's presence without even knowing it. And yet, in the darkest place, in the dungeon, blind, mocked, forgotten, Samson knelt, and in that surrender, he was stronger than ever before. Samson died in the temple of Dagon. But I believe his soul rose in glory, because after all, he chose surrender over pride. And I wonder, how many of us today are like Samson, strong on the outside but weak within, called but wandering far from the covenant? If you've failed, if you've ever felt like God has left me, then remember, Samson's hair grew back, and God still hears prayers from the bottom of the pit. If you are in a season of life where everything feels blurred, if you were once called, once dreamed, once believed, but now all that's left is ashes, disappointment, and silence, then remember this: Samson's hair grew back, and that was not a random detail. It was God's message to you today. It is never too late to pray, to return, to step back onto holy ground, even if you once walked away from it. God does not need you to be perfect. He only needs your surrender. You may have fallen, but if you can still say to God, "Strengthen me just once more," then you still have hope. And if this story has touched you, and share it, because maybe somewhere out there, someone is standing in the Dagon temple of their own life, and they just need a reminder to pray one more time. Please subscribe to the channel, because we are not just telling stories. We are resurrecting what was thought to be dead. And Samson, the strongest man in the Bible, said it did not win by strength, but because at the end he chose surrender. Prayer Station, where stories are not just told, but brought back to life.